Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is January 26th, 2026, and today we are opening file that I think most people assume was probably closed decades ago. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin.
The single most controversial, and I mean, certainly the most studied artifact in human history.
And usually when we cover historical mysteries, we're looking at, dusty old books or long settled arguments.
hmm
But the reason we're doing this deep dive now is that the science on this has just absolutely exploded in the last, 18 months.
Oh, easily. We're looking at a stack of research specifically from late 2024 through 2025 that is dragging us in two completely opposite directions.
It really is. It's a massive case of scientific whiplash.
It is. If you look at the forensic reports from Brazil that just dropped, you'll be convinced it's a a beautiful piece of art, but art nonetheless.
But then,
But then you look at the crystallography data coming out of Italy at the exact same time, and you'll be convinced it's physically impossible for it to be a fake.
and our mission today is to sit in that discomfort. We aren't here to prove faith, and we're not here to debunk it. We're here to see how modern tech, from 3D rendering to X-ray scattering, can apparently prove two contradictory things at once.
Exactly. We're going to look at the artist theory versus the relic theory, but strictly through the lens of the latest data. We're talking publications in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, Archaeometry, and reports from the Institute of Crystallography.
So just to set the stage for anyone who's managed to avoid this topic, we're talking about a 4.4-meter strip of linen kept in Turin, Italy.
Right.
It bears this faint sepia-colored image of a man who has been crucified. And for a long, long time, the debate was simple. Is it Jesus of Nazareth or is it a painting?
Right, that was the old binary. But that binary is, well, it's gone. We really have to start with the skeptics because the work coming out of Brazil recently is just fascinating. This is the geometry argument, and it completely changes how we have to look at the cloth.
This is that study by Cicero Moraes, published in Archaeometry. And this really clicked for me because it deals with something we see every day, maps.
Maps!
Yeah, projection distortion. If you take a globe, a 3D object, and you try to flatten it onto a 2D map, what happens to Greenland?
It gets huge. It looked absolutely massive because you're stretching a curved surface onto a flat plane.
Exactly. And Moraes argues the same exact thing happens to a human face. If you took a linen cloth and wrapped it tight around a human head,
Okay.
covered in, say, blood or pigment, and then you took that cloth off and flattened it out on a table, the image wouldn't look like a portrait.
No, it wouldn't. This is what Moraes calls the Mask of Agamemnon effect. He used digital software, tools like MakeHuman and Blender, to simulate this.
And what did he find?
When you wrap a cloth around a 3D digital head and flatten it, the ears get pushed way out to the sides, the face gets incredibly wide, the features look bloated. It essentially looks like a deflated balloon.
Which just makes sense, right? If you unwrap a burrito, the tortilla doesn't look like the burrito anymore. But when we look at the Shroud of Turin,
You see a dignified, proportionate face. It looks like a standard portrait. The ears aren't on the sides of the head. The face isn't distorted or widened at all.
so geometrically speaking, a real body wrapped in a cloth shouldn't produce the image we see on the shroud. That feels like a smoking gun against authenticity.
It's a very strong point. So Moraes tried a different simulation. He tried to figure out how he could match the shroud's image.
Okay, so if it's not a real body, then what?
Instead of a full 3D body, he wrapped the digital cloth around a bas relief.
A bas relief, you mean like a shallow sculpture, the kind you see carved on a coin or a church door.
Exactly that. It has depth, so it is 3D, but it's very compressed. It's much flatter than a full human head. And when he simulated pressing a cloth against that shallow relief sculpture,
The distortion went away.
it went away. The resulting image didn't have that bloated effect. In fact, it matched the proportions of the shroud almost perfectly.
Wow. That is a pretty heavy blow to the authenticity argument. It suggests the image wasn't made by a body, but by some kind of mold.
It implies that a medieval artist, maybe somewhere between 1200 and 1300, created a metal or stone sculpture, heated it or painted it, and then pressed the cloth onto it to create a relic for pilgrims.
And that would align with the timeline skeptics have always preferred, because bas-reliefs were incredibly common in religious art during that specific period. It's a very clean explanation.
It is, but the medieval artist theory doesn't stop there. We also have to talk about the blood.
Ah, yes. This is the forensic analysis by Barini and Garlaschelli.
That's the one. They published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, and they basically treated the shroud like a cold case crime scene.
Which seems logical. I mean, if it's a burial cloth, the blood stain should follow the laws of gravity. Blood flows down. It's not
Yeah.
complicated, right?
You would think. So they used a live-in volunteer and a mannequin, and they used both real and synthetic blood to track the flow patterns. They positioned the body in every conceivable way, lying flat, arms crossed, suspended, just to see if they could replicate the stains. They found stains that, well, they essentially defy physics.
Okay, give an example. What does a physics-defying blood stain even look like?
So take the arms. On the shroud, you have these rivulets of blood running down the forearms from the wrists. Borini and Garlashelli found that for the blood to run at that specific angle, about 45 degrees, the person couldn't be lying flat in a tomb.
They had to be upright.
Or suspended in a very specific way, almost like they were crucified with their arms above their head. But even then, the flow in the shroud suggests multiple angles that don't match a single position. It gets more problematic, though, with the lance wound in the side.
The spear wound.
Yes. On the shroud, the blood from that wound flows in these neat, separate little rivers. It looks very composed.
But in their experiment,
when you have a wound that size and gravity takes over, you don't get rivulets. You get a messy single pool of blood. It's more like a sledge.
so the blood on the shroud looks tidy.
It looks artistic. And there was one stain, this belt of blood across the lower back, that they couldn't reproduce at all. No matter how they moved the mannequin, gravity just wouldn't send the blood there.
Their conclusion, then, is that the blood patterns are unrealistic. They look like what a painter thinks blood should look like, not what it actually does.
That's it. So if you stop the deep dive right here, you have a slam dunk case. The geometry says sculpture, the blood flow says artist. It's a medieval masterpiece. Case closed.
Except, science is never that cooperative, is it? Because while one team was busy proving its medieval sculpture, another team, the Institute of Crystallography in Italy, was analyzing the fabric itself. And the results from late 2024 and 2025 suggest the exact opposite.
This is the work of Dr. Liberato De Caro, and this is where we have to get our heads around a technique called WXS.
Wide-angle X-ray scattering. That sounds intense.
It's surprisingly elegant. So to understand this, we need to understand how linen ages. Linen is made of flax fibers, which are essentially cellulose chains. Think of these chains like a long string of pearls.
Okay, string of pearls. Got it.
Over centuries, over millennia, background radiation and thermal energy cause these chains to break down. The string of pearls starts to snap into smaller and smaller sections, and this happens at a very predictable rate.
So it's kind of like a molecular clock.
Exactly like a molecular clock. But unlike carbon-14, which destroys the sample to count atoms, WAXS uses X-rays to measure the length of these cellulose chains without ever damaging the cloth. It's looking at the structural integrity of the crystal inside the fiber.
And what did the X-rays see when they looked at the shroud? Because it's medieval, it should look, semi-old.
They saw extremely short, degraded cellulose chains. The structure was highly broken down.
How broken down? Like medieval broken down?
Much, much more than that. They compared the shroud's decay profile to linen samples that are confirmed to be from 1260 to 1390 AD, the medieval period. They didn't match. The medieval linen was too new. Its structure was far too intact.
So the shroud is older than the Middle Ages.
Much older. To find a match, De Caro had to go back to samples from Masada.
Masada, the fortress in Israel, the one the Romans besieged back in the 1st century.
Yes. We have linen samples from Masada that are historically dated to between 55 and 74 AD. When De Caro compared the X-ray scattering of the shroud to the Masada linen, the curves, they overlapped perfectly.
Wait, just so I'm hearing this correctly, structurally, the Shroud of Turin is identical to linen woven in Israel in the 1st century.
That is what the physics is telling us. The decay suggests a 2,000-year-old fabric.
Now, I can practically hear the skeptics shouting at their speakers. What about temperature? Couldn't heat speed up the aging? If you put a shirt in an oven, it degrades faster, right?
That is a great question, and the researchers actually modeled that. They asked, okay, what would it take for a medieval cloth made in 1300 to look this old?
Right. Could you artificially age it by baking it?
You could, but the math is incredibly specific. They calculated that to achieve this level of cellulose breakdown in just 700 years, the shroud would have to have been kept at a constant temperature of about 22.5 degrees Celsius.
That's a warm room.
A warm room and 55% humidity every single day without interruption for 7 centuries.
Which is impossible. This thing was in drafty cathedrals, it was carried around in processions, it was in fires.
Exactly. It went through massive fluctuations. And usually, Colder temperatures, like a stone church in winter, would slow down the aging process. So the random environmental changes over 700 years actually make it harder for a medieval cloth to look this old.
The simplest explanation.
The most parsimonious explanation scientifically is that it looks 2,000 years old because it is 2,000 years old.
This is the paradox I was talking about. Geometry says medieval, physics says ancient. But we have to address the elephant in the room, the carbon-14 test.
The infamous 1988 test.
Right. In 1988, three world-famous labs, Oxford, Arizona, Zurich, tested the shroud. They came back with a date, 1260 to 1390 AD. It was front-page news. Shroud is a fake. Why are we even talking about this 38 years later if that test was so definitive?
Because it turns out that test might have been well botched. And we only know this because a researcher named Tristan Casabianca actually had to sue the British Museum to get the raw data.
He had to sue them. That seems defensive on their part.
It took a Freedom of Information request and a whole legal battle. For decades, the labs only released the average final dates. They never showed their work, the raw data points. When Casabianca finally got the numbers and analyzed them, he found serious statistical problems.
What kind of problems?
The main one is something called heterogeneity.
Explain that for us.
In a valid carbon-14 test, if you take 3 samples from the same cloth, they should all give you roughly the same date.
Sure.
But the raw data showed that the dates varied wildly depending on which specific millimeter of the sample they were looking at. There was a weird gradient.
Which suggests the sample wasn't pure.
Exactly. And this brings us to the repairs theory. You have to remember where they took the sample from in 1988. They cut a strip from the very bottom corner of the shroud.
The edge. That just seems like the worst possible place. That's where people hold it.
It's where people hold it, and it's also where damage happens. We know the shroud was damaged by fire in the Middle Ages. We even have historical records of nuns using a technique called invisible reweaving.
What's that?
It's a highly skilled darning technique where you stitch new threads, often dyed cotton, directly into the old fabric to repair holes. It's done so seamlessly you can barely see it with the naked eye.
So if the 1988 labs cut a sample from a repaired corner, they might have been testing a mixture of 1st century linen and 14th century cotton.
Precisely. And if you mix 2,000-year-old carbon with 700-year-old carbon, you get an average date that looks like the Middle Ages. This is why so many modern researchers believe the 1988 sample simply wasn't representative of the main cloth.
Plus, there's the contamination issue, isn't there? This thing isn't a rock, it's a sponge.
Yeah, it is. Linen is porous. For centuries, this cloth was exposed to candle smoke, incense, the breath of millions of pilgrims. During the 1978 exposition, it was hanging out in the open for weeks.
So it's absorbing modern carbon right out of the air.
And biological contaminants. Bacteria, fungi, they grow on the fibers. If the cleaning protocols in '88 didn't remove 100% of that modern biological layer, it would skew the date significantly younger. So between the weaving and the contamination, that gold standard test from '88 is looking pretty tarnished.
Okay, so we can essentially put the 1988 date in the questionable pile. Which brings us back to the synthesis. We have to try to hold these two truths in our heads at once.
It is the ultimate puzzle.
Truth A. The material, the flax fibers, is structurally identical to 1st century Israeli linen. Truth B. The image looks like a projection of a bas-relief sculpture, and the blood flow is weird.
So how do you reconcile that? One theory, and this is a sort of middle ground theory, is that the cloth is a genuine antique. Maybe a medieval artist found a 1,300-year-old burial shroud from the Holy Land.
It decided to enhance it.
Perhaps. Maybe the original image was too faint, so they used a bas-relief and some pigment to make it more visible for the pilgrims.
It's a plausible theory. It would explain the ancient age of the cloth and the geometric distortion of the image. It solves the puzzle.
What?
I hear a huge but in your voice.
But it fails to explain the negative quality. And this is the thing that really keeps scientists up at night.
Remind us about the negative.
When you take a photograph of the shroud and you look at the negative, the image becomes a positive. It becomes incredibly realistic with detailed shading and 3D information. It implies the shroud itself is a kind of photographic negative.
And we're suggesting a medieval artist in 1350 created a perfect photographic negative.
Before the concept of photography even existed, it's extremely difficult to explain how or why an artist would do that or even could do that.
And DeCaro's team noted something else about the depth of the image, didn't they? This idea of superficiality.
This is crucial. Even if you argue an artist used a scorch or a rubbing, those processes, they penetrate. If I paint on linen, the oil soaks in. If I scorch it with a hot statue, the burn goes deep.
But on the shroud,
The image exists only on the very top, outermost fibrils of the thread. We are talking about a thickness of 200 nanometers.
200 nanometers, that's almost nothing.
It's thinner than a human hair, much, much thinner. The center of the thread is white, the back of the thread is white. It's like a microscopic surface discoloration.
So we don't have a known artistic technique that can scorch just the top 200 nanometers of a fiber without damaging the core?
Not really, no. And this brings us back to the biological markers. We touched on the blood earlier being unrealistic in its flow. But chemically, DeCaro and others found nanoparticles of ferritin and creatinine bound to the fibers.
I'm not a biologist. What does that mean?
High levels of creatinine and ferritin are released into the blood during severe physical trauma. We see this in torture victims or people who have been beaten to death. It indicates extreme muscle breakdown.
So the blood on the cloth, even if the flow pattern is strange, contains the chemical signature of torture.
Exactly. A medieval artist using animal blood or red ochre paint just wouldn't have that specific chemical profile. So now you have biological markers of real trauma sitting on a cloth that is physically 2,000 years old, carrying an image that looks geometrically like a sculpture, but physically like a photographic negative.
It's maddening. It's like every time we invent a new technology, we think, okay, AI will solve it or X-rays will solve it. But the tech just confirms a different piece of the puzzle that contradicts the last piece.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? If it were a clumsy fake, modern microscopy should have torn it apart by now. We should see the brushstrokes. If it were obviously a miracle, the carbon dating should have been clean. Instead, we have a deadlock.
So DeCaro actually has a sort of philosophical take on this, right?
Yeah.
The distinction between how and why.
He does. He makes the point that science studies natural laws. If the image formation involves something outside of those laws, what a believer would call the resurrection, a burst of radiation, something like that, science literally cannot replicate it because it's a singularity, a one-time event.
So we can analyze the cloth, but we can't analyze the event that made the image.
Exactly. We are left with the physical aftermath of an event we can't explain.
So what does this mean for you, the listener? We've got listeners who are religious, listeners who are atheists, and listeners who just like a good mystery.
I think it means we have to get comfortable with, I don't know, we live in a world where we expect Google or AI to have a binary answer, true or false, real or fake.
And the Shroud is the last great thing that just refuses to play by those rules.
It really is. It's a mirror. If you look at it with the eyes of an artist, you see art. If you look at it with the eyes of a physicist, you see ancient history.
And maybe that's the point. Whether it's a mirror of the gospel, as Pope John Paul II called it, or the most genius conceptual art piece of the Middle Ages, it forces you to think.
It forces you to wonder if we've really figured everything out yet.
I want to leave everyone with a thought. Is it possible that the cloth is authentic, but our understanding of image formation is just limited? Or is it possible that a medieval artist was so brilliant that he managed to find ancient linen, fake a chemical blood profile, and create a negative image that would fool 21st century X-rays?
Both options seem equally impossible.
And yet the cloth is there.
It is.
That is a wrap for this deep dive. We'd love to know where you land on this. Are you team X-ray or team sculpture?
Or is there a third option we haven't even invented the technology to see yet?
Let us know. Thanks for listening and stay curious.